Have you ever watched an older TV show and thought, hey, this hasn't aged well? I'm sure you said yes, because this happens literally all the time. Even series from the early aughts and tens have aged poorly, to put it plainly. I recently started True Blood that originally premiered all the way back in the year 2008. I was enjoying the series without much thought until it was suddenly revealed that Bill Compton, who's like the main love interest, is suddenly revealed to be a former Confederate soldier. Not even just a Confederate soldier, but a former plantation owner. I was like taken aback. I had seen this before, but when? Then I remembered Jasper Hale in Twilight. Suddenly I became conscious of a trope I didn't even realize existed. Former Confederate vampires. Why are there so many, specifically in modern media? What do making these vampires former Confederate soldiers do to the overall themes of this media? These are the questions that we are going to answer today. Serving in the Confederate Army is most often used to create the ultimate American anti-hero. While never necessarily integral to the plot, by making the vampire previously serve in the Confederate Army, the writer explores the themes of redemption and morality, typically at the expense of Black bodies. Hello, hi, welcome, or welcome back to Mia Likes Movies. My name is Mia, and I like movies. I like a lot of other things too, but Mia Likes Movies just sounded the best. I have on a Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2 shirt, a cape from Walmart, and I tried to do like a Victorian inspired look for today. We're also in the new space, finally, in my new apartment, and I don't know if this will be the setup, but this is what we have going for now. If I keep looking up, it's because I'm looking at my script / my teleprompter. We're just getting through. So if it wasn't clear already, we're gonna talk about the trope of former Confederate soldiers turned vampires in our modern media. Let's just get started. So while I was doing my research, I found a video by Princess Weeks entitled, "Why Are There So Many Confederate Vampires?" which was published about a year ago. This video really helped me in my research, and I highly recommend watching it before watching this video. Consider it almost like a prerequisite to this video. She answers the questions of what the Confederacy is, how the trend emerged, and why it is still prevalent today. Really important things, so watch that quickly and then come back here. Princess Weeks looks at the trope from a strong political and sociological lens. I wanted to analyze the thematic implications of the trope within the stories it appears in. I think it's important to analyze how these writers actually are using the trope just as much as it is important to analyze how the trope came to be. And if we look at how the trope is used, we can look at how to fix it, and that is exactly what I wanted to look at today. Most of my viewers, according to my analytics, are American, so I assume you kind of already know what the Confederacy is. That being said, I do have a small audience outside of the US. I see you UK viewers, I see you. So if you didn't know, education in the US varies widely from state to state, and that is because education for the most part is seen as a state issue. So states will make the policies and legislations regarding education within their state. There are some federal, like overarching rules about education, like everyone has a right to a free education. As far as what that free education is and what the access to that is, the states will make the policies regarding that. Each state also has the right to decide what is being taught in their schools. And where this kind of comes up the most is when it comes to how the Confederacy and how the Civil War is taught in each state throughout America. What I learned about the Confederacy as a student in Pennsylvania will vary quite differently from someone who was raised in Tennessee or even someone who was raised in Washington State. That being said, the Confederate States of America, also known simply as the Confederacy, that's probably what I'll refer to it the most throughout this video, lasted from about 1860 to 1865 and was made up of about 11 southern states that seceded from the Union. I say about because I think West Virginia left like halfway through the Civil War and then some joined later, so it's like a mesh of different states throughout like the 5 years that it existed. This secession led to the United States Civil War, which led to the Confederacy's ultimate demise in 1865. Many Americans argue about what the Civil War was about. Most people that come from formerly Union states, which is generally like northern states, will tell you that the war was over the right to own slaves, while some people from formerly Confederate states, which generally speaking are southeast states, may tell you that the war was over what is called states' rights. And both are true in a way. The war was over states' rights, but it was over states' rights for them to own slaves. It was about the right to continue the institution of slavery in each state. You see, by this point in history, the North had mostly moved beyond slave labor in their economies. So their economies did not depend on slave labor because of the rise in industrialization up north. They had machines to rely on instead. But that was not true for the majority of the South, which relied on slave labor in order to harvest crops on their farms. So a lot of people in the South saw abolition as a threat to their state's rights, their state's economies, but it was about slavery because their economy hinged on slave labor. That's the truth. It's not funny, but it's kind of ridiculous that people don't think that. Mike LaSalle once wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle the following: "They say that history is written by the victor, but the Civil War has been the rare exception. Perhaps the need for the country to stay together made it necessary for the North to sit silently and accept the South's conception of the conflict. In any case, for most of the past 150 years, the South's version of the war and Reconstruction has held sway in our schools, our literature, and since the dawn of feature films, our movies. After the Civil War, we saw a sort of rebrand of the fallen Confederacy. Known now as the Lost Cause narrative, or the Lost Cause of the Confederacy, is the mythos that the cause of the Confederacy during the Civil War was heroic. This is why a lot of former Confederate states teach the Civil War in the way that they do. The Lost Cause was mostly headed by Southern white women in this group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, amongst other groups, but they're the main culprits here. Members of the United Daughters of Confederacy erected monuments, conducted field trips, gave out memorabilia, and more in order to glorify the Confederate cause in a way to preserve the customs and values of the Old South and Confederacy. UDC members also often censored or edited textbooks and would sponsor school essay writing contests to ultimately promote this cause. In her essay, Lost Cause Motherhood, Southern Women Writers, Glenn Robbins writes that the United Daughters of the Confederacy and others championing the Lost Cause narrative emphasized three specific pillars. The first is that slave owners were civilized in trying to help their slaves. The second, that Confederate soldiers should be praised in their attempt to defend their families, women, and children from attacks. They really portrayed the North and slaves as these monsters and a threat to the Southern way of life. And finally, that the Reconstruction era was oppressive, focusing mostly on political corruption, Northern revenge against the South, and the rise of Black power. Their propaganda clearly worked, as we still see its effects today. Education in a lot of these formerly Confederate states are still affected, like I've already said, and statues honoring former Confederate soldiers and generals still stand erected all over the South. I remember when I saw one for the first time in real life when I moved to Nashville. I remember looking at a statue and realizing very quickly that it was a former Confederate soldier, and I'd never seen one before because I came from Pennsylvania, which was a Union state. It's just wild that they're still there. The Lost Cause narrative also affects a lot of our modern media, especially those in the Southern Gothic genre. So we've talked about Gothic literature before in my All About Astarion video, but what exactly is Southern Gothic? Wikipedia actually summarizes the themes of this genre in a pretty good way. Common themes of Southern Gothic include storytelling of deeply flawed, disturbing, or eccentric characters, sometimes suffering from physical deformities or insanity, decayed or derelict settings, and grotesque situations, and sinister events bred from poverty, alienation, crime, violence, forbidden sexuality, and more. Personally, my favorite Southern Gothic writer is Tennessee Williams, and my least favorite is William Faulkner. Hugh Faulkner, you know what you did. While traditional Gothic literature often took place in castles, Southern Gothic stories often took place on sprawling plantations and mansions, in either metaphorical or literal decay. The genre sort of became a commentary on the idyllic South and the Lost Cause narrative, exploring the more grotesque and macabre parts of the region's history and culture. A side note, Wikipedia lists both Resident Evil 7 and Red Dead Redemption 2 as Southern Gothic video games, and honestly, I'm all here for it. Overall, the genre has a surprising impact on our modern vampire media. The themes central to the Southern Gothic genre lend themselves well to the exploration of the vampire, specifically in America. Whether it is the isolation, the repressed sexuality, or the violence, all themes found in European Gothicism, thematically it makes sense that the evolution of Southern Gothicism, also upholding these themes, would lead to the evolution of the Southern vampire. No piece of media really encompasses this idea as much as Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. Interview with the Vampire was first published in 1976 and was eventually adapted into a movie starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise in 1994, and then again into a TV show starring Jacob Anderson and Sam Reed in 2022. For the purpose of this video, I'll be using mostly the 1994 film as the basis of my analysis, but most of my research was actually done on the novel itself. The full series of novels is known as the Vampire Chronicles, but is mostly referred to as Interview with the Vampire, the name of the first novel. So the novel marked a stark shift in the vampire genre, and unlike previous stories about vampires, Rice's novel gave them an explicit sense of eroticism as well as empathy for humans. Also, for the record, I can't pronounce Louis's name, so I'm gonna butcher the French. The crux of Louis, the main character's journey in the book, is the fact that he is remorseful and filled with guilt. The guilt is what drives his journey forward, which is a stark contrast to his foil and lover, Lestat, who famously likes and enjoys killing and torturing people.
Well, I like to do it. I enjoy it.
Their moral and physical back and forth is what makes up the conflict of the story. An important part of Louis's character, especially in the beginning of the story, is that he is a plantation owner. Now, this is about 100 years prior to the Civil War. In fact, it's really only like a couple decades after the American Revolution that we, the audience, are introduced to Louis. The Civil War and the Confederacy do not actually affect Louis's story, so I consider him and Interview with the Vampire as a whole like a separate thing from this trope, and I think of it more so as like the progenitor of the trope. The thing that makes Anne Rice and the Interview with the Vampire different from more modern iterations of the Southern Gothic vampire is that she actually acknowledges slavery in her work. Is it the perfect representation of Black people? Absolutely not. But she does acknowledge their existence in this time period and how the events of the story may affect them, something we will not be able to necessarily say about our later stories, to say the least. In the movie, we actually first meet Louis in the modern era being interviewed by a reporter played by Christian Slater. I did not know Christian Slater was in this movie. He is forever my crush. Christian Slater, I love you. Louis recounts his life to the reporter, starting with his time as a plantation owner in Louisiana. After being attacked and turned by the vampire Lestat, Louis regrettingly accepts Lestat as his master and welcomes him into his home. Lestat tries to encourage Louis to kill and feed on humans, but Louis resists, instead drinking on the blood of rats and chickens. In one instance, Lestat and Louis go to an upper-class aristocrat party. Lestat remarks that one woman's husband mysteriously died prior to her marriage to a much younger man, saying she blamed a slave for his murder. Imagine what they did to him. By including this line, we are reminded of the setting of the story and the privilege granted to our main characters, Louis and Lestat, as they essentially kill without much consequence. After this incident, the slaves on Louis's plantation are seen praying and performing rituals surrounding the chickens that we can presume Louis has fed on. We can also probably assume that Lestat has fed on some slaves as well, which he does do in the books, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but we are not shown this in the film. Louis has a slave named Yvette. When Lestat goes into town to feed one day after getting annoyed with Louis, which is a likely thing for him to do, Yvette tries to comfort Louis. At this moment, Louis is unable to control himself and he attacks her, feeds on her, and kills her. Remorseful and guilty, Louis burns down the entire plantation and frees his slaves. After this, Louis and Lestat go on the road, and the setting continues to change as they journey through their immortal lives together. The next person that Louis kills is a child named Claudia. However, unlike Yvette, Claudia actually gets to live on as Lestat turns her into a vampire to be their daughter. Yvette is disposable to the plot, a mere moment in Louis's character development, whereas Claudia becomes integral to the latter portion of the movie, because Louis sees himself reflected in Claudia as her character develops. So does Louis. So while Louis and Interview with the Vampire are outliers in the trend for multiple reasons, I found it was still important to look at this for this video essay. Anne Rice essentially created the Southern Gothic vampire and set the scene for later writers. While there are issues with her disposable symbolism of Black characters in the story, she at least acknowledges their existence in the narrative. In Ki Young Jang's essay, Louis the Plantation Owner, The Haunting of Vampiric Slavery in Interview with the Vampire, a very long title but a very good essay, they argue that the similarity between vampirism and slavery in that, like the vampire, a slave master also lives off of a slave's life and work. And that just like in vampirism, a slave master needs a slave for his sustenance. In my opinion, Rice uses the setting of the Old South to sort of heighten the tragedy and violence of Louis and Lestat's immortality. Louis shows remorse towards killing and feeding from Yvette and sets the slaves free due to his guilt. Lestat feeds from aristocrats and slaves alike, showing an overall lack of care for the human experience. Additionally, because the late 1700s are just so far removed from our modern experience, the flashbacks also emphasize just how old Louis is, overall highlighting his immortality, which is a major theme throughout the story. Again, do I think Anne Rice is the blueprint on how to handle Black characters and slavery in a vampire story? God, no. However, I think it's important to analyze how the keystone author of the modern vampire genre does, especially as we move on to analyze the stories that follow it. Speaking of which, True Blood was an HBO TV series that aired from 2008 to 2014 and ran for 7 series. The series is based on the Southern Vampire Mysteries novels by Charlaine Harris, which were published between 2001 and 2013. The series follows Sookie Stackhouse, who is a young telepathic waitress living in the fictional town of Bon Toms, Louisiana. Vampires have recently revealed their existence to the general public after the invention of a synthetic blood drink called True Blood. So they no longer have to rely on human blood for sustenance, and they can exist in the human world without harming humans. Other mythical and supernatural creatures like werewolves, fairies, witches also exist within this universe. So our first out of our 3 Confederate vampires that we will be talking about today is Mr. Bill Compton. For our analysis, I really wanted to focus on one episode, which is season 1, episode 5, also known as Sparks Fly Out. I did this because, 1, I wanted to create a more contained analysis and argument, especially since we're talking about narrative impact on themes and things like that. And 2, I haven't finished the series yet, and there are a lot of episodes, so one day I'll finish it. So I chose this episode specifically because it's the episode where we are first introduced to Bill's backstory as a former Confederate soldier. So for context, in the episode right before this one, Bill and Sookie go on, it's not a date, it's not a date, but they're hanging out together. And they go to a vampire bar to get some information or potential information on some of the local murders that have been happening. And at the beginning of this episode, season 1, episode 5, Sookie is very adamant about not wanting to go out with Bill anymore. Sookie's grandma, Gran, has just invited Bill to speak at her Descendants of the Glorious Dead meeting, which is a large local group that meets together to discuss local history about the Civil War. Descendants of the Glorious Dead is a very obvious reference to groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, just if that wasn't clear. Gran tells Sookie that everyone in the group is super excited to meet Bill, but Sookie tells Gran that Bill isn't as nice as he seems and that her and Bill actually don't have that much in common. She says this because she thought that Bill was being really mean and controlling towards her in the previous episode. And at this moment, we start to see the seeds of what Bill's character represents be planted. Outwardly, he is this quintessential Southern gentleman, but is that truly who he is underneath his sexy, calm exterior? So I can't remember if it was in this episode or the episode before. I didn't write it in my notes, but at one point, Gran, Bill, Sookie, and Tara, who is Sookie's best friend, are at like a dinner together, and Tara, who is Black in the show, she's actually white in the books, but she's Black in the show. When they're talking about Bill's past, Tara asks if Bill had owned slaves. And Sookie's like really embarrassed. She's like, oh my God, Tara, why would you ask that? And Bill's like, I didn't own slaves, but my dad did. It's an easy cop-out because it like removes some accountability from Bill's complacency in the Confederacy. Like, it's not something that he took part in. It's just something that was placed upon him or happened upon him. But it's not just like a set of circumstances. It's owning slaves. Like I mentioned before, in the books, Tara is white. So in the books, it goes a little bit differently, but in the show, that's kind of how it went down. So back to episode 5, Sookie, Tara, and Sam, who was like Sookie's other sort of love interest in like the first couple of seasons, are at the meeting for the Descendants of the Glorious Dead. And Tara is obviously like really uncomfortable because she's the only Black person in the room, but that is kind of like everyone else is like having fun. Bill takes the stage and the floor is opened up for questions, and a man asks if Bill remembers his great-grandfather who fought in the war, and Bill actually does, and he tells a little bit of a story. The questions end up becoming a bit more personal, and it's revealed that after he was turned, Bill was unable to return to his family. Turns out, Bill had a whole-ass wife and 2 kids. Sookie's like young. She's like really young, so like when you remember that, you're like, damn. Bill, you're old. Stay away from that child. Again, we see Bill being painted in a way of like a martyr or a hero, someone who bravely sacrificed himself to the war effort, and although he was made into a monster, he made sacrifices to protect his family. And because at this point we have already established that he did not own slaves, Bill, again, is sort of being portrayed as like a cog in the machine, someone who had no other choice and ended up losing their humanity in the process. We are seeing the effects of the lost cause narrative in real time, literally and metaphorically. Later on in the episode, we get a flashback of Bill lost at night during the war. He finds a cabin and he thinks it's safe. He goes inside and he stumbles upon this woman who is a widow, and her name is Lorena. She gives him some food and she allows him to shelter in the cabin. But Lorena tries to make some sexual advances on Bill, but Bill refuses as he has a wife and 2 kids. He tries to leave and Lorena attacks him, feeding and turning him into a vampire. In True Blood lore, the person bitten must drink the vampire's blood in order to turn into a vampire. So Lorena drinks enough blood from Bill to almost kill him, and she tells him that if he ever wants to see his family again, he has to drink her blood. She tricked him, which was not nice. After this encounter, Bill tries to go home back to his wife and 2 kids. This man has 2 kids. He's a vampire and he can't go back to his family. His life is completely different now. He has no choice. Again, we are being told that Bill makes this ultimate sacrifice for his family. He already joined the army to fight for Southern independence, a sacrifice for the greater good. Then he refuses Lorena's advances, showing loyalty to his wife and family. And then after Lorena essentially tries to kill him, Bill drinks her blood in order to see his family again, which is 3 sacrifices. Count them. 1, 2, 3. Sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. We, the audience, are meant to see Bill as a martyr that fell upon unfortunate circumstances and is trying to do good. I feel like it's also important for me to mention that at the end of this episode, Gran dies. In this episode, Gran is revealed to be a Confederate sympathizer, and then at the end of the episode, she dies. She's murdered. And this is like one of the major problems with this episode. We don't have enough time to reckon with the dichotomy that is one of the sweetest characters of the show who practically raised Sookie and Tara, also having a fascination with the Confederacy. It doesn't get explored at all because she dies. She's almost like absolved of all sins because she's murdered. And we're just like, damn, that sucks. Bill's backstory does get explored in further episodes. He and Lorena are like ruthless killers, and Bill breaks away, which is like a redemption arc. Bill also like becomes the antagonist of the series at one point. There's even an episode entitled Lost Cause, which is a direct reference to the Lost Cause narrative, where we flash back to Bill's recruitment in the army, and one of Bill's dad's former slaves named Minus is also introduced. Bill is even called a Yankee sympathizer at one point for not glorifying the Confederate cause. And this episode with Minus and Bill's recruitment story is in the final season, season 7. So it's a very different show than season 1. They're different showrunners at that point. I mention all of this to kind of show Bill's overall arc and symbolic purpose of his character within the greater narrative of the show. As Monique Rojas writes for the Atlanta History Center in her essay From Dixie to Dracula, The Evolution of the Confederate Vampire Trope, Bill's character embodies the tension between nostalgia and guilt, reflecting the South's complex Confederate legacy. Through him, Harris explores themes of redemption, identity, and the consequences of history, making Bill a sympathetic figure despite his bloodthirsty nature. In True Blood, vampires are the other, and can be seen as a metaphor for other kinds of otherness, such as sexuality or race. There are many times throughout the show where coming out of the coffin jokes are made, alluding to the gay coming out of the closet jokes, which is an on-the-nose reference, but one that works nonetheless. Alan Ball, the creator of the show and showrunner from seasons 1 through 5, is also a gay man and has frequently talked about vampires as a metaphor for marginalized groups and sexuality in general in relation to the show. In my opinion, I think True Blood does a really interesting exploration of representation and otherness in modern media. I think the setting of the South also elevates it because we get the complicated relationship between conservatism and otherness reflected back to us. What the TV show also does well is incorporate more black characters like Tara and Lafayette, who apparently is killed off very early on in the books for some reason. And these characters are allowed to be imperfect and complicated and make mistakes. Again, is it perfect representation? No. But for a decade-old television series about vampires, the representation for marginalized communities in America is not completely horrible. So is True Blood perfect? No. But I think it does try in ways that many other stories do not, so you gotta give credit where credit is due. And like I said, I am still finishing the series, and I actually spoiled a lot of things for myself while I was researching this. But I couldn't not mention Bill, because he's the one that inspired this whole thing. And also because the next vampire on this list, in my opinion, is a lesser version of him. So without further ado, let's move on to Jasper Hale. The Twilight series, If You Live Under a Rock, is a series of novels by Stephanie Meyer that was first published in 2005. The main series has 4 novels, Twilight, New Moon, Eclipse, and Breaking Dawn, all of which came out between 2005 and 2008. Meyer also released a short novella, The Short Second Life of Bree Tanner, and 2 other novels, Life and Death, Twilight Reimagined, which was a gender-swapped version of Twilight, and then Midnight Sun, which was Twilight, but from Edward's perspective. And Midnight Sun, being the most recent release, came out in the iconic year of 2020. What a year. Due to the book series' popularity, the main saga was eventually adapted into 5 movies. Breaking Dawn was split into 2 parts, as my shirt references, because it's a Breaking Dawn shirt. I mean, like, this series was iconic. If you don't know about the Twilight series, like, what were you doing? For this analysis, we'll be focusing on the 3rd film, Eclipse, because that is the film in which we get most of Jasper's backstory. Jasper Hale is one of the vampires in the Cullen clan. I'll refer to the Cullen clan, the Cullen family, or the Cullen coven. It all references the same thing, the group of vampires that were created and turned by Carlisle Cullen. Edward's a Cullen, if that wasn't clear. So Jasper is also Alice's partner. From the first couple of films, all we kind of get from Jasper is that he's like kind of off, and that Alice is his rock. He's basically like this wild card, and Alice is the only reason he has any like semblance of normalcy to him. And that is because out of everyone in the Cullen clan, Jasper is the most recent one to become vegetarian. In the Twilight universe, there are vampires that drink human blood and those that do not, and the latter kind of vampires are referred to as vegetarians. Pretty simple. So the overall plot of Eclipse focuses on Bella and the Cullen clan attempting to overcome Victoria's newborn army. Victoria, if you don't remember, is from the first movie. She had the red hair. She's one of the evil vampires. So newborn vampires are notoriously bloodthirsty as they deal with their sudden strength and craving for blood, their newfound vampire powers. And it's also said throughout the series that the first like 7 months of a vampire's life is when they are at their strongest, still learning how to control their powers. Jasper is like a really minor character in the Twilight universe, so we don't have a lot to discuss about his impact plot-wise, at least, but Eclipse is like his big moment in the series. And this is because Jasper actually had his own, well, not his own, but was involved with a newborn army back in the day. The Cullens and the Quaalude team, which were the werewolves, Jacob and his werewolves, team up to fight Victoria's newborn army. Jasper essentially trains them based on his intimate knowledge of newborn vampires. So we get a flashback of Jasper's past. Jasper was the youngest major in the Texas Cavalry during the Civil War, which is an absolutely crazy lore drop for, again, a very minor character in a Mormon vampire romance series. While he was serving, Jasper met a woman named Maria, and she purposely chose him to turn into a vampire because she needed someone with these leadership qualities to train her newborn army. Jasper was also sort of in love with Maria, but Maria was just using him. These wars that Maria and Jasper were fighting in were known as the Southern Vampire Wars, which timing-wise, for some reason, seemingly coincided with the American Civil War, but actually sort of like continue into the modern era, but they have treaties and truces, so they're not really fighting anymore. Anyway, ironically, the Southern Vampire Wars were more so about territory disputes than they were about using and turning people into newborns for their own gain without their will. But we don't have to draw that parallel because Meyer doesn't, so I guess it doesn't matter. We don't get a lot of information on what happens between the Southern Vampire Wars and the present for Jasper's character, but we know at some point during the mid-20th century, he decides to change his ways. He becomes like a nomad and like wanders the United States, searching for a new purpose in life. And during this time, he meets Alice, and then he joins the Cullens and becomes a vegetarian. Eclipse's major themes are mortality and choice. Bella has to choose between Edward and Jacob, as well as life or death. Edward representing death because she would have to die and turn into a vampire to be with him forever, or life with Jacob. Also, with the threat of the newborn army, the threat of death for everyone is omnipresent throughout the story, even for the immortal characters. Jasper's character acts as the mentor, calling upon his past as a general in two armies to help the team overcome this threat. However, in the overall story, Jasper is meant to be a symbol of change and reformation, a formerly violent killer that was turned peaceful by his deep love for Alice. Their relationship is meant to serve as a sort of mirror to Bella and Edward's relationship. Is Jasper, being a Confederate soldier, then vital to the story? No. Technically, in my opinion, Jasper could have served in any army throughout history, and it still would have the same effect on the story. You could argue that him being a soldier in the Confederate army supports the idea that he was previously this very violent and immortal man, even prior to turning. However, if you watch the films, his time in the Confederacy gets sort of romanticized. His battle scars are seen as a fun character quirk, especially in the delivery of the line. In fact, all of the actors' delivery of the lines during this flashback sequence is very nostalgic for his time in the army. We actually don't hear a lot about Jasper's time during the Civil War, but we just get the idea that he was like really talented, and Meyer doesn't really address what the Civil War is about during the telling of the story either, which is an issue. Instead of truly discussing what it meant to serve in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, it's just quickly glossed over in order to support Jasper's character development. Bethany Gemmell wrote a really wonderful essay for Curious discussing this called The Hidden White Supremacist Backstory in Twilight. She writes, "With this origin story, it is nearly impossible to argue that the character of Jasper did not at some point hold racist, pro-slavery views during his lifespan, or even to this day, as suggested by his wistful tone in his film portrayal. A Confederate soldier could not feasibly move up within the ranks of a military structure intended to continue racist atrocities with ignorance towards the Confederate mission." And this is the issue that happens when a writer just casually uses the Confederacy as a tool for minor plot development. Whether it was her intention or not, Meyer uses lost cause tactics in her writing. Meyer seemingly always conceived of Jasper being a former Confederate soldier. During a Q&A on her blog, Meyer actually wrote that she searched through roll calls of the Confederate Army in Texas and found both Jasper and Whitlock on the lists separate, but she ended up putting them together for his name. But like I already said, wouldn't him serving in any other war during history have like basically the same effect? In fact, I think it would maybe even make his character even stronger. In my opinion, Meyer wanted Jasper, like Bill in True Blood, to be a redemption story. Jasper was good, a high-ranking honorable general, then bad, a bloodthirsty vampire army general, and then good again, Alice's pet. I think Jasper should have served in one of the world wars. Now hear me out, okay? He's a general in a world war, could be one or two. I think either could work. And, you know, he does his fighting and he gets turned and recruited to fight in the newborn army regardless, right? The only difference is that it's a little bit later and he's in a world war. Okay, I'm just workshopping this. If he served on the side of the Americans in either World War I or World War II, we as Americans, the primary audience for this movie, we would automatically perceive his mortal life as one of honor. This would make his turn into a bloodthirsty vampire even more impactful. But I think the reason why Meyer chose the Civil War was so that Jasper had to serve and fight on American soil. I literally think that's the only reason why she made him a Confederate soldier, so that he had to be stuck in America. But you know what? Fuck it. Put him in the fucking American Revolution. I don't know. Why not? I just don't think there's a good enough reason to make him a former Confederate soldier in this story. Because if you don't acknowledge the true reason for the war, it just becomes antebellum era propaganda, whether unintentional or not. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Last one. Finally, we move on to the Vampire Diaries. Now, I want to say, out of all of the series that we've talked about so far, this is the one I know the least about. Up until researching this video, I had not seen a single episode. I had no desire to see a single episode. I just want to make that clear. I know very little about this series. My best friend in high school loved this series, and anything I know about it prior to watching this one episode that I watched, I knew through her. So shout out to Jada. So the Vampire Diaries were actually originally a series of novels as well, and were published all the way back in 1991. Which is crazy. The first few novels were written by L.J. Smith, but then were written by a ghostwriter and then by Aubrey Clark. The last book in the series was published as recently as 2014, which is crazy because that's like 20 years of books. That's a long time. Eventually, the books were adapted into a television series for the CW by Kevin Williamson and Julie Plec. The series ran from 2009 to 2017 with 8 seasons. The series also spawned 2 spin-off shows, The Originals and Legacies. The series also has other supernatural creatures within the universe, like werewolves, witches, and more. And in my research, the overall major themes of the series are love and choice and morality and family, I guess. I don't know, this ain't Fast and the Furious. So for my analysis, I chose arguably the most infamous episode of the series, which is season 7, episode 10, Hell is Other People. Again, I want to remind you, I have very little experience with the series. This was the first and only episode that I've ever watched. I know nothing. I know nothing. This is a very outside perspective. In this episode, Damon is trapped inside something known as the Phoenix Stone. And the Phoenix Stone, which is also sometimes referred to as the Hellstone, is meant to trap vampire souls. Damon is trapped in the Phoenix Stone because this guy named Julian was trying to avenge Damon's mom's death because Julian was Damon's mom's mother. And Julian trapped Damon and Stefan, who is Damon's brother, in the stone. So he has both of his souls in the stone. So that might be wrong. I think that's right though. Correct me if I'm wrong though in the comments below, because I'm not watching this whole ass series. Damon is trapped in the Hellstone. When you're trapped in the stone, you relive your own personal hell, and it's kind of on loop. At least that's the experience that we get with Damon here. He's reliving one specific day in his life, and it's the day when he, as a Confederate soldier, was tasked with finding and arresting some deserters and returning them to the general. Damon only takes this task upon himself after receiving a written note from his brother Stefan, and he's trying to go home. So he's like, if I take on this task, I can get out of here. So Damon and his fellow soldier named Henry go on this mission, and Damon's actions cause the deserters to die. It's important to note that throughout these flashbacks, Damon's mom is also constantly showing up, but she's not actually in the memory. She's more of an apparition, kind of haunting the narrative and haunting Damon and his personal hell. This will become important later. So after the deserters and the traitors are killed, Damon wakes up in the real world. He finds out that Stefan is also trapped in the stone and that Julian has stolen Stefan's body. So Damon goes after Julian, but then Julian torches Stefan's body, and then Damon ends up back in hell, and he relives that day with the deserters over and over again, changing his tactics, but not his ways. Eventually, Stefan does show up in one of Damon's visions because Stefan has gotten out of his personal hell in the Hellstone, and he's trying to help Damon navigate how to get out of his. And he helps Damon realize that the only way to get out of his personal hell is to deal with his mommy issues, as they are the center of all of his issues. So Damon then gets flashbacked even further and sees his mom again. It's still during the Civil War, but for some reason his mom is there. I don't know. She's dying. So Damon finally gets to apologize to her and tells her that he misses her. It's a really cathartic moment, and he tells her he should have given her more chances, and he didn't. And then she dies. And Damon is broken. He's heartbroken. He then wakes up in real life and he's really confused. He attacks everyone around him, killing them in a rage, and they're all dead. And that's how the episode ends. What a weird episode, by the way. Is that how the whole show is? Here's the thing. There's no reason why Damon is a Confederate soldier. None. In the books, Damon and Stefan are from 15th century Italy, not 19th century Southern America. And from what I found on Reddit and Tumblr, this change in the adaptation really angered some fans and seemed really out of place. A lot of people blame showrunner Julie Plec for this decision, but girl, I don't know. I just got here. There really is no thematic reason for Damon to have served in the Confederate Army. The whole purpose of the flashback sequence is for Damon to come to the conclusion that he has to deal with his mommy issues. We literally did not need the backdrop of the Confederate Army to do this, at all. This redemption moment for Damon and his mom could have happened at literally any other point in time and could have the same impact, if not more, because it was about their relationship and not about the events around them. them. So why did they make him a Confederate? I don't know. A line that is constantly repeated by Henry, Damon's fellow Confederate soldier, upon waking is, "Hi there, hero. You've been out a long time." And this line signals to Damon and the audience that the cycle of hell has restarted. It, like most of the Civil War flashbacks in this episode, are really played up for comedic effect. The repetition of events and lines sort of build upon each other, and Damon's reactions to the repetition are supposed to be funny. Additionally, the use of the word hero is very purposeful in this moment because Damon is not a hero, but in this moment he is, in a way, trying to be. It's ironic, but it's also weirdly true. So when Damon first wakes up from his hellscape, he remarks that his time was just a brutal Civil War drama. That's a direct quote, by the way. Damon is very callous and dismissive of this time in his life. Damon's character in general, it seems, is more of an anti-hero out of him and Stefan, so this outlook does not seem out of character for him. That being said, the fact that he was even in the army at all is out of character for him. I was reading a Screen Rant article called Vampire Diaries, 25 Things That Make No Sense About Damon Salvatore by Stephanie Roehler, and number 15 on this list was joining the Confederate Army. And in this article, Roehler writes, "It was oddly obedient of Damon to head to war, and after years of rebelling and disagreeing with his father, it wouldn't be new for him to disappoint his dad and not go. It would have made more sense for his character to never enlist in the first place." Even after only watching one episode, I completely agree with this statement. It's like very obvious. It doesn't make any sense for him to be there. It turns out the moment that Damon kills the deserters is the first time he ever has blood on his hands, which I think is the reason why they chose to make this incident sort of the touchstone for his hellscape in the Phoenix Stone. However, Damon remarks, "Hell is being raked around the coals for something I haven't even thought about in 150 years. So like, was that moment like really impactful for him if he hadn't thought about it in 150 years? No. The whole reason Damon joined the army was to please his dad. The whole reason why Damon takes on the mission to arrest the deserters is to get back to his brother. And the whole reason why these flashbacks happens for some reason is to apologize to his mom. Like what? But like the thing is, the flashback itself actually has nothing to do with his mom. So it doesn't make any sense for it then to be the reason that leads him to apologize to her, because she has nothing to do with what is actually happening in the flashback. Once Damon realizes that hell is his mother, the flashback about the deserters is no longer relevant and they switch to a different flashback entirely. And it's no longer about the deserters that he's killed or the blood on his hands, it all becomes about his mom. In fact, after this, they don't acknowledge the Union sympathizers at all. They just move on. Apparently, Damon does eventually desert the army, stating that he hated everything that the Confederacy stood for, and maybe that is true, but in this episode, we do not see that. Overall, I just think this episode is like extremely poorly written. Metaphorically, the one that they are trying to create for Damon just falls flat, because like I said, Damon serving in the Confederacy has nothing to do with his mom. It's all about his dad and his brother. So in order to get out of the Phoenix Stone, he has to reconcile with his mom. So like it doesn't make sense to juxtapose those two events in the same episode. It just doesn't make any sense from a writing narrative perspective. And if it sounds like I'm not making any sense here, that's because it literally doesn't make any sense. They literally chose the backdrop of the Confederacy for no reason. They could have literally chosen any other army and it would have been fine. And I was searching online and I literally could not find a reason why they switched from 15th century Italy in their backstory to the Confederacy. Some argue that it was maybe to make the story more relatable to American viewers, which is their target demographic, but like we discussed with Jasper, if you don't really acknowledge what the war was about, you are really just supporting the lost cause narrative, whether on purpose or not. My thesis while writing this video essay was, serving in the Confederacy is most often used to create the ultimate American anti-hero. While never necessarily integral to the plot, by making the vampire previously serve in the Confederacy, the writer explores the themes of redemption and morality, typically at the expense of Black bodies. We see with Bill, Jasper, and Damon, all of these writers attempt to tell stories of redemption. Anti-heroes and ruthless killers that have found humanity in spite of their existence as monsters. The writers use the Confederacy as a way to signal their ruthlessness in humanity. However, rarely do these writers acknowledge the true cause for the Confederacy. In doing so, they ignore the violence Black people suffered under the institution of slavery. True Blood is the only series out of the three to attempt to acknowledge the effects of the Confederacy and lost cause narrative on modern Black Americans. However, Twilight and the Vampire Diaries essentially ignore slavery. Instead, they choose to focus on the internal struggles these Confederate soldiers may have faced. This, even unintentionally, also supports lost cause narrative, romanticizing the struggle and ultimately downplaying the long-lasting effects of the institution of slavery. The trope has since sort of faded away, and to be honest, thank goodness for that. As we've discussed quite thoroughly, this trope more often than not romanticizes the Confederacy in a way that glorifies the soldiers' heroism whilst ignoring the horrors that supposed heroism was defending. We can understand what the trope was trying to do, which was creating metaphors for redemption and guilt, while also understanding that the impact of the trope is one that mirrors the real-life issues of propaganda and education in the United States. Controversially, I do think this trope has some validity, and I think exploring it really can ask the question of who deserves redemption. But I think that can only happen if you really acknowledge the history of the time. If we were to ever get a resurgence of Confederate vampires, unfortunately, I think another Trump presidency is the perfect time for that to happen. Hot take, but the rise of conservatism, which often hinges on the repression of sexuality, which is a common theme in vampire media, paired with the current conversation around education in the South and America as a whole, really does set the stage for Southern Gothic vampire stories to be told. But can it be done well? That is yet to be seen, and I guess we will have to wait and see. All that being said, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I worked really hard on it, and I told myself I wasn't allowed to see Nosferatu until I finished it. So now that this is out, I can finally go see it. I'm free, I'm relinquished of my duties, and I'm so excited. Let me know your thoughts below. I asked in a poll what your favorite modern vampire media was, and in order, it was Interview with the Vampire, True Blood, Twilight, and then at the end, the Vampire Diaries, which controversially is my rating as well. Also, a very happy new year to you all. I'm so excited for the year ahead. Thank you for watching, and I also wanted to thank Xylorb, who has been a member of my channel for a very long time now. I have since shut down my memberships, but I felt I would be remiss in my duties if I did not properly thank Xylorb before starting this new year, which is a fresh start for the channel. So thank you, Xylorb. Thank you everyone for watching. I'm so happy you're here. I'm excited for this new year of content, and hopefully I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.